There is a version of World War I that has been told so many times it no longer feels like history. It feels like a monument, something carved from stone, draped in poppies, visited by schoolchildren who are taught to feel something without being told exactly what happened. The version most people carry in their minds involves mud and courage, sacrifice and futility, men going over the top into machine gun fire for reasons their governments never fully explained and never fully answered for. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The parts that were removed, the parts that were quietly set aside by censors and commanding officers and medical boards and newspaper editors, those are the parts that explain what the war actually did to the men who fought it and what those men eventually stopped fighting against. Not the enemy, not the shells, not even death. What they stopped fighting against was the war itself. The slow, grinding, mechanical process of being consumed by something so large and so indifferent that resistance eventually ceased to feel rational. This is not a story about heroism. It is not a story about cowardice either. It is a story about normalization, about the specific and documentable process by which human beings adapted to conditions that should have been incompatible with continued functioning, and how the institutions around them actively encouraged and enforced that adaptation because the war required it. Because the war, above all else, required bodies, and bodies that could still move and still follow orders and still climb out of trenches were more valuable than bodies that had reached their limit. So the limit was moved. Again and again and again, across 4 years, the limit of what a man could endure was renegotiated, always upward, always in the direction of more. The soldiers of the First World War did not go mad in a vacuum. They went mad, and then they were told they were not mad, and then they were sent back. And what they carried back with them, what they learned to carry because there was no alternative, became the hidden architecture of that conflict. The things that no letter home could describe, the things that the official war artists were not commissioned to paint, the things that the medical establishment spent years refusing to name. Those things are what this account concerns itself with. It begins before the trenches. It begins in the mobilization itself, in the sheer mechanical scale of what the European powers set into motion in the summer of 1914. The logistics of moving millions of men from their homes to the front were staggering. Trains ran continuously. Depots filled and emptied. Men were processed through induction centers with a thoroughness that resembled manufacturing more than military service. They were measured and weighed and vaccinated and issued clothing that frequently did not fit and assigned numbers and moved along. The individual disappeared almost immediately into the aggregate. A man was no longer a person with a name and a family and a history. He was a unit. He was a number on a manifest. He was part of a calculation. And the calculation was simple: how many bodies could be placed at a given point on a given day, and how many of those bodies would still be functional after the engagement, and how many would need to be replaced, and how quickly could the replacement be accomplished. This was not a secret calculation. It was an administrative one. The paperwork was meticulous. The filing was impeccable. And the men who were the subject of these calculations were, in the beginning, almost entirely unaware of how completely the logic of the institution had already absorbed them. The first thing soldiers accepted, though it took time and it took pressure, was the smell. This is not a small thing. The human olfactory system is deeply connected to the brain's threat detection architecture. Certain smells trigger revulsion as a protective reflex, an evolutionary signal that something in the environment is dangerous or decaying or diseased. The trenches of the Western Front produced smells that should have been physiologically incompatible with continued occupation. Rotting flesh, human waste in quantities that no sanitation system could manage, the particular chemical smell of high explosives mixed with disturbed earth, gangrene, unwashed bodies, rats, standing water that had absorbed everything the trench had to offer over weeks or months. Men who arrived at the front for the first time frequently vomited. Some could not eat. Some reported being unable to sleep because the smell penetrated everything, including the brief moments of unconsciousness the body managed to steal between barrages. And then, within days, sometimes within hours, the smell receded. Not literally. The smell did not go away, but the brain stopped flagging it as an emergency. The adaptation was neurological. It was automatic. The threat signal was overridden by familiarity. And this was the first lesson the trench taught, which was that the body would eventually accept what the mind found unacceptable, given enough exposure and enough time. Commanders knew this. They did not know it in neurological terms, but they knew it experientially. They knew that fresh troops were often less reliable in their first engagements than seasoned troops, not because the veterans were braver, but because the veterans had already processed the sensory environment and were no longer spending cognitive energy on managing their own revulsion. The shock had been used up. What remained was function, and function was what the war needed. The dead were the second thing. In civilian life, in peacetime, the management of the dead is a ritualized and protected process. There are procedures. There is a ceremony. There is a formal transition between the state of being a person and the state of being a body. The First World War did not permit this transition in most cases. The dead accumulated faster than they could be managed. In the aftermath of a major assault, the ground in front of and behind the trenches was covered with bodies in various states of completeness, because shellfire does not produce intact corpses. Men who had been standing in a group when an artillery shell landed were simply no longer intact in ways that permitted individual identification or individual burial. The pieces were sometimes gathered, sometimes they were not. Sometimes they remained in place and became part of the landscape. Wire obstacles were festooned with fragments of men who had not made it through. No man's land between opposing trenches became, over the course of months and years, a kind of open cemetery in which the burials were incidental and the decomposition was continuous, and the smell, which we have already addressed, was partly the smell of these men returning to the earth, whether anyone had arranged for them to do so or not. The soldiers who lived in proximity to this landscape adapted to it. They had to. A man who could not function while looking at a dead body was a man who could not function on the Western Front, and a man who could not function was a problem, not a person with a problem. A problem. The institution had no facility for people with problems of this kind. So the adaptation occurred. Men ate their rations within yards of decomposing bodies. Men slept in dugouts, where the walls sometimes contained the remains of men who had been buried by previous shell hits and then disinterred by subsequent ones. Men stepped over and around and occasionally on the dead as a matter of practical navigation, and they stopped registering it. Or rather, they stopped registering it as something that required a response. The dead became furniture. They became topography. A soldier might note the position of a particular body in the same way he might note the position of a particularly large shell crater, as a navigational landmark, as something to avoid or route around, with no more emotional content than a feature on a map. This was not callousness, or rather, it was not the same callousness that the word implies in peacetime contexts. It was a managed state. It was an adaptation that allowed continued function. The men who maintained it were not worse people than the men who could not. They were simply people who had been in the trench longer. The third thing was noise. The artillery barrages of the First World War were, by the standards of human history up to that point, and for decades afterward, the loudest sustained sounds that human beings had ever been subjected to. The guns on the Western Front could be heard across the English Channel. In quiet conditions, they could be heard in London. Inside the zone of active fire, the sound was not merely loud. It was a physical force. It moved through the body. It disrupted cardiac rhythm. It caused temporary and, with enough exposure, permanent hearing loss. It produced concussive effects in men who were near enough to large explosions, but not near enough to be killed. A phenomenon that was not yet understood in medical terms, but was understood experientially as a kind of rattling loose of something that had previously been secured inside the skull. Men went deaf. Not always permanently, but frequently, and the deafness was frequently partial. which meant that certain frequencies became inaccessible while others remained intact. Communication became difficult. Orders were misheard. Men shouted at each other at close range and still struggled to be understood, and the noise never stopped. Even in the relatively quiet periods between major offensives, there was no silence on the Western Front. There was always artillery somewhere. There was always the sound of the guns, receding to a low, continuous presence in the background, a frequency that the body eventually incorporated into its baseline state of awareness. Men described it afterward as a silence that had a sound in it, a quiet that hummed. They could not return to ordinary silence. Ordinary silence felt wrong. It felt like the moment before something happened. The guns had replaced the natural baseline of the auditory environment so completely that their absence was more alarming than their presence. This is the mechanism. This is what normalization does at its most granular level. It does not make the terrible thing disappear. It makes the terrible thing into the reference point against which everything else is measured. And once that inversion occurs, it is extremely difficult to reverse. The fourth thing was the rats. This may seem lesser than what has preceded it. It is not. The rats of the Western Front were not incidental. They were a consequence of the same conditions that produced everything else. Enormous quantities of food waste and human waste and dead matter in a confined area produced an environment in which rats thrived and multiplied to densities that were, by any civilian standard, extraordinary. Men reported waking to find rats on their faces, rats gnawing at their equipment, rats running across them in the dark with a familiarity that suggested they had no memory of or interest in the distinction between a living body and a dead one. The rats were well fed. They were large. The trenches produced men who described them as being the size of cats, and while this was likely an exaggeration generated by disgust and darkness, the exaggeration had a basis in the genuine size that the animals achieved in that particular environment. Men killed rats when they could, trapping them, hitting them with entrenching tools, occasionally shooting them in quiet moments when the noise of a single shot would not attract unwanted attention. But the killing had no effect on the population. The rats were beyond management. And so, as with everything else, accommodation occurred. Men learned to sleep despite the rats, learned to secure their food against them with whatever means were available, learned to regard them with a flat irritation rather than the active horror that a civilian encountering the same situation would feel. Some men, it was reported, fed particular rats, named them, observed their behavior with something that resembled affection, or at least with the kind of tolerant attention one pays to a creature that has made its home in your space and shows no sign of leaving. This is a small thing, but an important one. The naming of a rat, the feeding of a rat, the particular form of attachment that some men develop toward animals in the trench, whether rats or the occasional stray dog or the cats that some units kept. These attachments were not sentimental in the usual sense. They were a way of maintaining a connection to the idea of choice in an environment where choice had been almost entirely removed. The man who chose to feed the rat was exercising agency. However small and however strange, it was a decision he had made that had not been made for him by the institution. The institution did not prohibit this. The institution had no opinion about rats, except insofar as rats spread disease, which they did, and insofar as disease reduced the number of functional bodies available for operations, which it did. But the individual soldier's relationship with the specific rat he had named and occasionally fed was beneath the notice of the administrative apparatus, and so it survived. Small, ridiculous, necessary. The fifth thing was the food. Ration systems in the First World War were designed around caloric sufficiency and logistical practicality rather than palatability. The food that reached soldiers in forward positions was frequently cold by the time it arrived, having been carried in containers that were inadequate to maintain temperature across the distances and delays involved in frontline resupply. It was often contaminated by proximity to the environment, because the containers leaked or because the men carrying them were unable to prevent contact with the mud and the water and the other material of the trench. It was monotonous to a degree that cannot be adequately conveyed without repetition. Bully beef, hard-tack biscuits, tea, bully beef, biscuits, tea, again, for weeks, for months. Soldiers described losing the ability to taste the food after a certain point, which may have been partly psychological and partly a consequence of the general sensory overload of the environment, desensitizing the more subtle registers of experience. They ate because the body required fuel. The act of eating ceased to be associated with pleasure or even with satisfaction. It was maintenance. It was a mechanical necessity identical in its logic to cleaning a rifle or checking ammunition. The body needed to continue functioning. The food accomplished that. The food was consumed. This was the relationship. Men who survived the war and returned to civilian life frequently described an inability to take pleasure in food for extended periods afterward. Some described it as lasting years. Some said it never fully returned. The war had decoupled eating from enjoyment so completely, had reduced the act to such a pure instrumentality, that the reconnection required deliberate effort and, for many, was never fully accomplished. The sixth thing, and here we arrive at something the official records were least willing to address, was the relationship with fear. Fear is a legitimate biological response to genuine threat. It is not a malfunction. It is, in evolutionary terms, among the most successful adaptations the organism possesses. And the men who went to the Western Front were afraid. They were afraid before their first engagement, and they were afraid before their 100th engagement. And the fear did not diminish with experience so much as it changed its character. In the beginning, fear was an acute condition. It was associated with specific events, the sound of incoming shells, the moment before going over the top, the specific and concrete imagination of what a particular projectile would do to a specific body. As time went on for many men, fear became chronic. It became a background condition, something the organism maintained at a continuous low level rather than spiking in response to specific triggers, because the specific triggers never went away and the organism could not sustain the spike indefinitely. The management of chronic fear was something the men developed largely without institutional support, because the institution did not recognize chronic fear as a legitimate condition requiring management. What the institution recognized was cowardice, which was a moral failing that carried a legal consequence, and what the institution recognized was shell shock, which was a medical condition that was poorly understood, frequently denied, and whose treatment was, in many documented cases, designed primarily to return the sufferer to duty as quickly as possible, rather than to address the underlying cause. Men managed chronic fear through ritual, through superstition, through the specific and elaborate personal systems of meaning-making that develop when a population is subjected to arbitrarily lethal conditions without adequate explanatory framework. They developed beliefs about particular objects that would protect them. Lucky charms, photographs carried in breast pockets, particular routines performed before operations. They developed beliefs about the random distribution of lethal events, about whether it was better to walk in a specific part of the trench, about whether the shell that killed the man beside you meant that the next shell would land farther away, or whether it meant nothing at all. They told each other things that were not true, and they believed things that were not true because the true explanation, which was that you were in a zone of industrial killing, and your survival was largely a matter of statistical chance, was not a framework within which continued function was easy to maintain. The institution sometimes encouraged the superstitions, not officially, not in any document that would survive, but in the practical sense that officers who understood that a particular charm or ritual was helping a particular man remain functional did not confiscate the charm or ridicule the ritual. The institution was not sentimental. It did not care about the charm. It cared about the man's continued functionality. If the charm produced functionality, the charm was tolerated. The seventh thing was the particular bureaucratic relationship with death. Every death in the British Expeditionary Force generated paperwork. This is not unique to this war. Military bureaucracies have always maintained records of casualties because the records serve administrative purposes, notification of next of kin, allocation of pensions, management of unit strength, requisition of replacements. But the scale of the First World War created a paperwork operation around death that men who were close to it described as having a peculiar effect on their relationship with mortality. You could be in a dugout filling out the forms relating to men who had been killed in the morning's engagement while the bodies of those men were still in the same trench, and the forms were specific and procedural and required information to be entered in particular boxes in particular ways. And the process of filling them out created a kind of administrative distance between the person who had been alive that morning and the statistical unit that was now being recorded. Men who served as officers and who were therefore responsible for generating this paperwork, in many cases, described it as among the more psychologically durable aspects of their experience, though they rarely described it in those terms at the time. The paperwork was a container. It gave form to the death. It turned it into something that could be processed and filed, and in being filed, made manageable. The form said, "This man existed. He was here. His details are recorded. His death is acknowledged by the institution." And in the same motion, the form said, "His slot will be filled. His replacement has been requisitioned." The operation continues. This was not cynicism on the part of the men filling out the forms. It was, in most cases, a practical coping mechanism that the structure of the institution made available. You could not grieve every man in the conventional sense because the conventional process of grief requires time and space and a stable relationship with the future that the trench did not permit. But you could note him, you could record him, you could make his death a matter of official record. And something in that act, something in the formal acknowledgement, served a function. The eighth thing was the particular adaptation to the sound and sensation of artillery at specific ranges. This requires some elaboration. Shell fire at close range, within 100 yards, produced a specific set of physical experiences. The pressure wave of the explosion, the sound, which arrived at the body before it arrived as intelligible noise, as a physical impact, a compression, the smell of the explosive and of the disturbed earth. The sensation of fragments passing through the air at high velocity, sometimes audible as a particular kind of buzzing or whipping sound, and the absence of that sensation in the cases where a fragment had passed very close to the body. Men who spent enough time under artillery fire developed an ability to assess incoming shells with remarkable precision. They could estimate, from the sound and angle of incoming fire, the likely point of impact with an accuracy that had survival value. They knew, or their bodies knew, when to flatten themselves, when to press deeper into the earth, when the sound indicated a shell that would land far enough away that continued movement was safer than stopping. This calibration was not conscious. It was not taught. It was learned from experience in the same way that any complex perceptual skill is developed through repeated exposure with immediate feedback. The feedback in this case was the most immediate possible. If your calibration was wrong, you were injured or killed. If it was right, you survived to refine it further. Over time, men developed a physical vocabulary of shell fire that was deeply specific and deeply accurate. And the process of developing it required not the suppression of fear, but the integration of fear into a functional perceptual system. The fear was there. The fear was informative. The fear had been domesticated into a tool. Veterans described this afterward as the thing that was most difficult to unlearn. They had learned to function in an environment where sudden loud noises indicated immediate lethal threat, and they had learned the specific behavioral responses that environment required, and those responses persisted after the environment was gone. Men who returned to civilian life flinched at car backfires, at doors slamming, at fireworks. The nervous system had been reconfigured to treat a category of sound as a survival signal, and the reconfiguration was not easily reversed because it had been reinforced thousands of times over years of genuine necessity. The ninth thing was the specific moral accommodation required by the act of killing. Most of the men who went to the Western Front had not killed anyone before. This is a statement that requires some elaboration. The act of killing another human being is not a natural act, in the sense of being an act to which the human organism is by default prepared and willing. There is evidence from multiple wars that a significant percentage of soldiers do not discharge their weapons or discharge them without aiming, even when engaged by enemy forces. And this is generally interpreted as evidence of a deep psychological resistance to killing that military training attempts to overcome with varying success. The training of the First World War was not sophisticated in this respect. It focused on mechanical competence with weapons, on discipline and obedience to command, on unit cohesion, but it did not explicitly address the psychological obstacle that men would face when required to direct lethal force at other human beings. What happened instead, what had to happen because the war required it, was that the obstacle was gradually negotiated away through exposure and institutional pressure and the specific cognitive processes that men developed to manage the moral weight of what they were doing. The enemy was dehumanized, not always in explicit terms, not always in the crude terms that propaganda used, but in the more subtle and more durable way that physical distance and categorical thinking accomplish. You were not killing a man. You were killing a German, a category, a uniform, an opposing element, the specific individual on the other side of the wire, the specific man whose face you might have seen on a patrol, the specific man who might have been your age and who might have had family and who was almost certainly afraid in the same ways you were afraid. That specific man was incorporated into the category, and the category was what you pointed your rifle at. This process was not total. It was not complete. There are too many documented instances of fraternization, of unofficial local ceasefires, of the Christmas truce of 1914, and the smaller, less celebrated instances of human contact across the wire that occurred throughout the war, for the dehumanization to be described as successful in any absolute sense. The men on both sides knew perfectly well that the enemy was also human. But they had learned, because they had to learn, to act on that knowledge selectively and to set it aside when the institution required them to set it aside. What persisted, and what the institution did not prepare men for, and did not provide resources to manage after the fact, was the specific memory of specific acts, not the general practice of killing, not the categorical violence of artillery and gas and machine gun fire, but the individual acts that preserved their individuality. The man seen through the sights of a rifle, the man encountered in a trench raid at close range, the man whose death was not part of an abstracted statistical process but was a specific event with specific sensory content that the memory retained in complete and accurate detail long after the war was over. These memories were not managed by the institution because the institution had no administrative category for them. They were managed or not managed by the individual men who carried them. The 10th thing was the relationship with the body's limits. The human body can endure more than most people in peacetime ever test. This is a fact about physiology that the First World War demonstrated at industrial scale. Men operated under conditions of physical stress that civilian medicine would have classified as incompatible with basic function. They did not sleep for days. They carried loads that orthopedic surgeons would describe as injurious under the conditions they were described. They maintained physical activity in environmental conditions, cold, wet, confined, in the presence of disease vectors that should have produced disability rates far in excess of what actually occurred. What actually occurred was still catastrophic. The rates of frostbite, of trench foot, of the various respiratory conditions produced by the environment, of the skin conditions produced by constant contact with wet wool and contaminated water, were enormous. But they were not as enormous as they would have been if the body had not been capable of extraordinary adaptation. Trench foot deserves specific attention because it illustrates the institutional response to physical degradation with particular clarity. Trench foot is caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions. The feet, confined in boots, in standing water, unable to be properly dried, begin to fail. The tissue loses integrity. In mild cases, the result is pain and disability. In severe cases, the result is gangrene and amputation. It was preventable, or at least its severity was reducible, through the regular changing of socks and the application of whale oil to the feet and the drying of the feet when possible. The British Army eventually made the prevention of trench foot a matter of military discipline. Officers were held responsible for the trench foot rates in their units. The logic was straightforward. Trench foot removed men from duty, and removing men from duty reduced operational capacity, and reducing operational capacity was a military problem that military discipline could address. So the problem was addressed through discipline. Men were required to submit to foot inspections. Officers who had high rates were noted. The measure worked to some degree. Rates declined. But the measure worked not because the institution cared about the men's feet, but because the institution cared about the operational capacity those feet represented. The feet were assets. Assets required maintenance. Maintenance was enforced. This is the logic of human expendability dressed in the language of welfare, and it is important to understand the distinction because the distinction is precisely what the men who lived within the system gradually ceased to make. After long enough in an environment where your value was consistently measured in terms of your operational utility, where your physical condition was attended to primarily insofar as it affected your capacity to perform your function, the internalization of that framework was almost inevitable. Men began to describe their own injuries and illnesses in operational terms. They were not in pain. They were non-functional. They did not need to be cared for. They needed to be repaired. The language of the institution had replaced the language of the person. The 11th thing was the particular accommodation required by gas. Chemical weapons were introduced on the Western Front in April 1915 when the German forces released chlorine gas along a 4-mile stretch of the front near Ypres. The soldiers on the receiving end of that initial attack had no framework for what was happening and no equipment to manage it, and almost nothing in their experience that allowed them to categorize what they were seeing and smelling and beginning to feel in their lungs. Men described a yellow-green cloud moving toward them at the speed of the wind and the smell, which was described variously as similar to bleach, to swimming pool water, to something sharp and chemical and wrong. And then the lung damage and the dying, which was drawn out and specific and not quick. Men drowning in their own tissue fluid, their bodies responding to the chemical insult by producing the protective response that the chemical insult made fatal. Within weeks, improvised protections were deployed. Wet cloths held over the face. Improvised hoods soaked in chemical solutions. Eventually, gas masks, which improved over the course of the war from crude fabric affairs to reasonably sophisticated respirators, though none of them were comfortable, and all of them degraded performance, and all of them had failure modes that were significant in the chaotic conditions of the trench. Men learned to put on a gas mask in under 10 seconds. They practiced this drill until it was automatic, until the hands could accomplish the task without reference to conscious instruction, because a second's hesitation in a gas attack had a specific consequence. The drill became reflex. The reflex became part of the body's repertoire, but the adaptation to gas went beyond the technical. It required an accommodation to the specific psychological horror of a weapon that was invisible, that operated through the air itself, that could not be dodged or fired back at, that was democratic in its distribution, covering trenches without regard for the relative positions of officers and enlisted men, finding its way into dugouts, persisting in low-lying areas where the heavier-than-air agents settled into hollows and shell craters and waited. The particular psychological impact of gas was not, as has sometimes been claimed, primarily its lethality. Gas killed a smaller percentage of its victims than artillery did. Its primary impact was the maintenance of a specific kind of anxiety, the anxiety of an invisible threat present in the most basic necessity of continued existence, the air itself. Men learned to wear their masks for hours during gas alerts, and then discovered that extended mask wearing produced its own distress, heat, restricted vision, difficulty communicating, the paradoxical sense of the protective equipment as itself a form of confinement. They managed this. They adapted. They extended the duration of tolerable mask-wearing through practice and through the same process of desensitization that governed their adaptation to everything else. The intolerable became tolerable. The tolerable became routine. The routine became the baseline from which the next intolerable thing would need to be processed. The 12th thing was the relationship with the concept of military discipline as it was actually practiced rather than as it was officially described. The official description of military discipline in the British Army of 1914 to 1918 was a document of structure and order and the reasonable application of authority in the service of operational necessity. The actual practice of military discipline in the trenches included things that the official description did not acknowledge and that the records were frequently constructed to obscure. The Field General Court-Martial was a military tribunal with simplified procedures designed for use in field conditions, and it processed an enormous volume of cases involving soldiers who had failed in some way to meet the operational requirements of the institution. The offenses ranged from genuine acts of military misconduct, disobedience, desertion under fire, to offenses that in any other context would have been classified as symptoms of illness. Sleeping at post, for example. A man who had been awake for 72 hours and who fell asleep at his observation post in a quiet period was guilty of an offense that carried the death penalty. Some men were shot for it, others received lesser punishments. The distinction was not always principled. The death penalty for military offenses was not a relic that the war discovered unused. It was applied. Over 300 British soldiers were executed during the First World War, the majority for desertion and a smaller number for a range of other offenses, including cowardice in the face of the enemy, a charge that was applied to men whose behavior under fire was deemed to have fallen below the standard required. Men were shot by firing squads drawn from their own units, because the deterrent effect of the penalty was considered to depend in part on its being witnessed and administered by those in proximity to the offense. The men who carried out these executions were soldiers who were themselves subject to the same pressures and the same conditions as the men they were executing. They were ordered to do it. They did it. They were not, in most cases, given the opportunity to decline. What this practice accomplished, beyond whatever deterrent effect it achieved, was the installation at the deepest level of the institution's logic of a specific and absolute principle. The demands of the operational system superseded the conditions of the individual. A man who could not continue to function was a problem. A man who refused to continue to function was a crime. And a crime, in the administrative vocabulary of the military tribunal, had a prescribed response. The system did not inquire too deeply into the reasons for the failure of function. It did not, as a general practice, ask what had happened to a man before he reached the point of running away, or refusing to obey, or doing whatever the charge sheet said he had done. It asked whether he had done it, and whether the evidence supported the charge, and if it did, it proceeded to the prescribed response. The men who remained functional absorbed this information. They absorbed the knowledge that the institution that they served would, under certain circumstances, kill them for failing to serve it adequately. And they incorporated this knowledge into their understanding of their situation, which was already an understanding from which most of the ordinary assurances of civilian life had been removed. And they continued. Because what else was there? Desertion was possible in theory, but was in practice extremely difficult. The front was not a permeable boundary through which individual men could pass without notice. The territory behind the lines was controlled. The ports were watched. The network of military police and civil authorities and social expectation was extensive, and the penalty was severe, and the men knew it, and most of them did not try, and of those who did try, most were caught, and some of those who were caught were shot. The 13th thing was the particular adaptation to the experience of being buried alive. This is not a metaphor. The artillery of the First World War produced shell fire of sufficient volume and force that the walls and roofs of dugouts and sections of trench were regularly collapsed onto the men inside them. Men were buried under earth and timber and sandbags. Some were killed immediately by the concussive force. Some were buried alive and died before they could be reached. Some were reached and dug out. The experience of being buried, of being enclosed in compacted earth with a restricted air supply, of being unable to move, of being unable to see anything or, depending on the degree of burial, to hear clearly, was an experience that a significant number of men on the Western Front had at least once. Some had it multiple times. For men who had experienced it once, the anticipation of its recurrence was a specific and durable fear. For men who had experienced it multiple times, the management of that anticipation had in some cases been successfully accomplished by mechanisms that resembled, in their observable effects, the management of any other chronic fear. It had been incorporated. It had been filed. It was a known quantity. This was not peace, it was function. The distinction mattered. The 14th thing was the replacement draft. When a unit suffered significant casualties, the replacements who arrived to fill the gaps were frequently very young men with very little training who had little understanding of the specific conditions they were entering. They would often be attached to experienced soldiers who were tasked, informally and without official protocol, with communicating the specific knowledge that kept people alive, where to stand, where not to stand, how to read the sounds, when to move and when not to, what particular sections of the trench were relatively safe and which were overlooked by enemy snipers. This transmission of knowledge was necessary, and it occurred, but it occurred in a specific context. The experienced soldiers had adapted. They had normalized. The specific knowledge they were transmitting was embedded in a framework of normalcy that the new men had not yet acquired. And the experienced soldiers, in transmitting the knowledge, were also transmitting the framework. They were teaching the new men through demonstration and through language and through the flat matter-of-factness of their own behavior that this was how things were, that the smell was manageable, that the dead were not a crisis, that the sound of incoming shells was a language you could learn, that the fear was not a reason to stop. They were performing normalization for an audience that needed to normalize quickly. And the performance was genuine because the normalization was real and both things were true simultaneously. The new men normalized. Most of them did. They had to. The ones who could not or could not quickly enough became problems in the institutional sense, which is to say, they became administrative items rather than operational ones, and they moved through the administrative system according to its logic. The 15th thing was the relationship with religion. The Church of England and the Catholic Church and the other religious institutions of the combatant nations provided chaplains who served with units at the front. These men occupied an unusual position. They were part of the institutional structure and were subject to its authority and its logic. But they also represented a set of values and a language of human meaning that were, in important ways, in tension with what the institution was doing. The chaplain's function included the provision of last rites and burial services, and the writing of letters to families of the dead, and the maintenance of morale, which the institutional framework understood primarily in terms of its operational value. A soldier who believed that his death would be meaningful, who believed that the framework of divine purpose surrounded and contained the chaos of his experience, was, in operational terms, more reliable than a soldier who had concluded that nothing surrounding him had meaning. Belief was an asset. The management of belief was a function. The actual content of belief, what soldiers actually believed and how they actually understood their relationship to whatever divine or transcendent framework they had been given, shifted over the course of the war in ways that the official religious institutions found difficult to manage. Men who had entered the war with conventional faith in a providential God found the conventional framework increasingly strained by specific experience. The question of why an omnipotent and benevolent God would permit the specific things that were occurring, the specific deaths of specific people in specific ways, was not an abstract theological question for the men who were watching those deaths occur. It was a question with existential weight. and the answers that were available, that God moves in mysterious ways, that the suffering has meaning we cannot comprehend, that death in service of a righteous cause is not a tragedy but a sacrifice. These answers were tested against specific events and found, by a significant number of men, wanting. What emerged in place of conventional faith was frequently something more idiosyncratic and more focused. Not disbelief in most cases, but a personal framework constructed from the available materials, traditional religion, fatalism, the superstition we have already discussed, a sense of compact with specific comrades that had a quasi-religious intensity. The unit became, for many men, the primary moral community. The obligations were to the men beside you, not to the abstract cause, not to the nation, not to the distant figure of the king or the general, but to the specific men in the specific trench with whom your life was immediately bound. These obligations were, in their way, absolute. They were the last thing that remained absolute when everything else had been relativized by experience. The 16th thing was hunger. Not the hunger of a missed meal or the discomfort of poor rations, but the specific sustained caloric deficit that men in forward positions experienced during prolonged operations. During major offensives, resupply became irregular and sometimes ceased. The logistical system, which was already stretched, was further strained by the specific conditions of an active engagement, the disruption of routes, the pressure on carrying parties, the diversion of resources to ammunition. Men went hungry in ways that produced the specific cognitive and physical symptoms of significant caloric restriction, difficulty concentrating, weakness, irritability, a narrowing of mental focus to the most immediate demands of survival. And then, in the particular way that hunger becomes manageable after a certain point, through the exhaustion of the acute awareness of it, a dulling, a state in which the fact of not having eaten became incorporated into the general conditions of experience rather than remaining as a specific and demanding need. This was added to everything else, to the noise and the smell and the dead and the rats and the shells and the cold and the wet and the gas and the fear. Each of these elements was individually manageable or had been made manageable through the process of adaptation. Together, they constituted an environment that was, in aggregate, an experience of total sensory and moral overload that the organism was managing through a kind of sustained triage, deciding continuously which demands required immediate attention and which could be filed for later, and in filing them for later was constructing the specific category of deferred experience that would become, for many men, the most durable and least tractable part of what the war left them with. The 17th thing was the particular experience of the medical system. Men who were wounded were processed through a system designed to return them to duty as quickly as possible. This was the explicit purpose of the casualty clearing station, the base hospital, the convalescent facility. The triage was not between the savable and the unsavable in the way that civilian emergency medicine understood triage. It was between the quickly returnable and the not quickly returnable. A man with a wound that could be treated within days or weeks was a man who could be returned to his unit. A man with a wound that would require months was a longer-term calculation. A man who was sufficiently severely wounded that he would not return to duty was, from the operational standpoint, a completed transaction. He was removed from the asset column and entered into the liability column, which would ultimately be settled through the pension system, or not settled, depending on the specific circumstances of his case and the specific administrative competence of whoever was handling the paperwork. The medical staff who operated within this system were, in the vast majority of cases, people who had entered medicine because they believed in the relief of suffering and the preservation of life. They were operating within an institutional framework whose priorities were not identical to their professional values, and the management of that tension was a specific and ongoing psychological challenge that the institution did not recognize and did not provide resources to address. They adapted. They became efficient. They developed the specific professional detachment that sustained function in the presence of high volumes of severe trauma, a detachment that was genuine and necessary and that some of them could not maintain indefinitely. and some of them maintained so successfully that they described it afterward as the experience of no longer being able to see patients as people, of seeing wounds and procedures and case notes, of having the specific mental file that contained the individual patient become thinner and more abbreviated as the volume of cases increased and the time available for each decreased. This was not a pathology. It was a professional adaptation to institutional requirements. It was the same logic expressed in a different role. Function was required. Feeling impaired function. Feeling was reduced. Function was maintained. The system continued. The 18th thing was the specific experience of what was called shell shock and what we would now recognize, with the benefit of a century of psychiatric development, as a cluster of conditions including post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress reaction, and various anxiety disorders produced by sustained exposure to the specific conditions of the Western Front. Shell shock was not, in 1914 or 1915 or even 1916, a recognized diagnosis. The symptoms it produced, the uncontrollable trembling, the inability to speak, the paralysis of limbs that had no physical injury, the intrusive sensory memories, the inability to function in anything resembling normal circumstances. These were initially explained in terms that reflected the institutional framework rather than a medical one. Men who exhibited these symptoms were, in the early period of the war, frequently categorized as cowards or malingerers. Some were court-martialed. Some were shot. The medical establishment resisted the implication that the war itself, the specific conditions of the industrial conflict to which men had been subjected, was the cause of these symptoms, because accepting that implication meant accepting a limitation on the war's capacity to produce functional soldiers indefinitely, and a limitation on that capacity was not something the institution was prepared to accept. So alternative explanations were developed. The physical explanation that the symptoms were produced by actual physical damage to the nervous system from the concussive force of nearby explosions was preferred because it acknowledged a physical cause without acknowledging a psychological limit. It implied that with rest and appropriate physical treatment, the symptoms would resolve and the man would be returned to duty. In many cases, the treatment regime was designed explicitly to accelerate this resolution, not for the benefit of the patient, but for the benefit of the institution that needed him back. The men who developed shell shock and who were processed through the medical system adapted to that system, or tried to adapt, because the system had its own pressures and its own logic, and non-adaptation to it was, as always, a problem in the administrative sense. Men learned to perform recovery. They learned the indicators that suggested to the examining physician that they were progressing toward return to duty. They learned, in some cases, to suppress the symptoms long enough to pass inspection and be returned to the front, where the symptoms returned or worsened, and the cycle began again. The 19th thing was the particular adaptation to the idea of time. Civilian time is organized around accumulation, around the expectation that the future will be different from the present, that plans will be executed, that goals will be reached, that the trajectory of the life is generally forward in a direction that means something. The trench destroyed this relationship with time. In the trench, the future was not reliably available. Plans extended no further than the next operation, which might or might not occur, and which might or might not be survived. The specific life plans, the marriage, the career, the house, the children, the ordinary future that the man had assumed before the war, had been placed in suspension, and suspension, extended long enough, becomes something else. It becomes an inability to imagine the future at all. Men describe this as a foreshortening, the imagination of the future contracted to the immediate. What will happen after this operation, after this tour, after the war? These questions became unanswerable, not because the answer was frightening, but because the question no longer felt like it connected to anything real. Time in the trench became cyclical and immediate. The day cycle, the rotation in and out of the line, the seasons, which were felt not as markers of passing time, but as changes in the specific physical conditions that had to be endured. Winter meant cold and frost and frozen mud that was in some ways harder to live with than summer's liquid mud, but that reduced the activity of certain organisms, the rats, the lice, the bacteria. Summer meant the smell was worse. It always came back to the immediate, to what was happening now, to what would happen in the next 6 hours. The long view was not a useful cognitive tool in the trench and was gradually abandoned. Men who returned to civilian life found that the cognitive tool did not immediately resume its function. The future remained somehow theoretical. Plans felt provisional. The specific confidence in the continuity of the self across time that civilian life assumes had been damaged in a way that was difficult to name and more difficult to repair. The 20th thing was the relationship with language itself. The First World War generated a specific language, a vocabulary, and a syntax that the men who served in it developed to manage the experience of managing the experience. Understatement was a primary feature of this language. Things that were terrible were described as bad. Things that were catastrophic were described as rather rough. The specific dead were described as having had it, or bought it, or gone west. Locutions that accomplished the work of acknowledging the death without requiring the emotional weight of the direct statement. This was not evasion in the dishonest sense. It was a functional adaptation of communication to the conditions of the environment. Emotional weight in language was a cost that the environment did not permit to be paid very often. So the language was compressed. It communicated information, which was what the environment required language to do, and it minimized the expenditure of affect, which was what the environment required from the organism. This linguistic adaptation served a function in the trench. It became a problem in the period after the war, when men tried to communicate their experience to people who had not shared it. The specific vocabulary did not translate. The understatement did not convey. The people who had remained at home did not have the referential framework that would have made the compressed language comprehensible, and the men who had been in the trench often found, when they tried to expand the compression, to unpack what bad or rather rough actually signified, that they did not have the tools to do it. They had adapted their language away from expressive specificity and toward functional economy, and the adaptation was not easily reversed, and the things it had processed were not easily recovered in their original form. The 21st thing was the specific and structured relationship with the enemy that developed at the unit level over time. This is a documented phenomenon that the official histories of the war generally minimize, because it complicates the narrative of sustained mutual hostility that the prosecution of the war required. What actually developed in many sectors, especially in quiet periods and in quieter sectors of the front, was an informal arrangement of mutual forbearance that bore no relationship to the official state of war and that was governed by a logic entirely its own. Units that faced each other across no man's land over extended periods developed an understanding of each other's routines, an awareness of each other's habits that produced a form of interdependence. Both sides had to eat. Both sides had food brought up at specific times. Both sides had officers who made rounds at specific hours. Both sides had snipers who were active at particular times and inactive at others. The informal arrangement was never articulated, never agreed to in explicit terms, never documented, and was in violation of every element of military law on both sides. But it existed. The live and let live system, as historians have called it, was widespread on the Western Front, particularly in the infantry trenches. It expressed itself in the timing of stand to and stand down. It expressed itself in the specific places where men chose to expose themselves and those where they did not. It expressed itself in the firing that was aimed to miss, in the retaliation for artillery that was directed at areas known to be unoccupied, in the complex and unspoken etiquette of mutual survival. The institution was aware of this and took deliberate steps to disrupt it, primarily through the rotation of units and through the mandatory raiding policies that required units in quiet sectors to conduct raids on enemy positions. the explicit purpose of which was not intelligence gathering, but the maintenance of an aggressive stance, the prevention of the informal accommodation from solidifying into something that reduced the operational capacity of the unit. The raids were deeply unpopular because the men understood what they were for. They were not for military advantage. They were for the maintenance of the killing. They were to ensure that the relationship between the opposing forces remained lethal rather than coexisting, because coexistence was incompatible with the operational requirements of the institution. The men conducted the raids. They hated them. They suffered casualties on them that they regarded as unnecessary, which they were. They brought back prisoners when they could, and noted that the prisoners were frightened men who were not different in any essential way from themselves. And they went back to the informal arrangements as soon as the institutional pressure was off, and the arrangements re-established themselves, and the rotation came, and the new unit arrived, and the arrangements had to be renegotiated with the unknown men across the wire. And this process repeated itself throughout the war in an ongoing demonstration that the men, given the choice, would choose not to kill each other, and that the institution, given the observation, would remove the choice. The 22nd thing, the last and the least manageable of all, was the knowledge of scale. The individual soldier on the Western Front existed within a system of a size and complexity that was beyond the capacity of any individual to comprehend. 4 years, 37 million casualties across all combatants, 17 million dead. Entire regions of France and Belgium reduced to something that no longer resembled landscape in any prior sense of the word, that had been processed through artillery to the point where the original topography was gone, and what remained was a different kind of terrain, a made terrain, a terrain shaped by industrial violence rather than geological process. The individual soldier could not know these numbers. He did not have access to them. The censorship that governed all communications from the front, the official suppression of casualty figures, the management of the home front's understanding of what was actually happening, meant that the scale was deliberately obscured from everyone, including the soldiers themselves. But they knew it in other ways. They knew it from the replacements that never stopped arriving. They knew it from the distances they could travel along the front without reaching an end. They knew it from the years. From the fact that it did not stop, from the fact that the specific operation that was going to end the war did not end it, and the next one did not end it, and the one after that did not end it, and the one after that, and the one after that. Through all the named battles that the military histories would catalogue and analyze and argue about, Ypres and the Somme and Passchendaele and all the others, the war continued. It continued past the point where it made sense. It continued past the point where anyone could construct a coherent explanation for why it needed to continue. It continued because the institutional machinery that sustained it had a momentum that was not subject to the ordinary checks of rational calculation, because the men who might have stopped it had been produced by the same institutional culture that the war was expressing, because the thing had a logic, and the logic was self-sustaining, and the men in it normalized that too. They normalized the endlessness. They normalized the fact that the specific thing they were being asked to endure was not temporary, and would not be made temporary by their patience or their suffering or their continued compliance. They normalized it because the alternative to normalizing it was a psychic position that could not be sustained while also continuing to function, and function was required, and they were still there, and the institution was still there, and the war was still there, and the paperwork was still being filed. The war ended in November of 1918, not because any of the essential conditions that produced it had been resolved, but because one side had run out of the capacity to continue. The armistice was not a peace, it was a cessation. The men who came out of the trenches carried the normalization with them. They carried the recalibrated nervous systems and the compressed language and the inability to imagine the future, and the specific memories that the language had been developed to compress, and the knowledge of what human institutions do when they require function from human beings. They carried all of it back into a civilian world that had been told that the war was a victory, and that the sacrifice had meaning, and that the men who had served were heroes, and the men who had served received the word heroes and held it and said nothing, because the language for what they actually knew had been developed for use in a specific environment. And the environment was gone, and the language no longer had a place to go. The influenza pandemic that swept through the demobilizing armies in 1918 and 1919 killed more people than the combat of the preceding 4 years had killed in some national contingents. The men who had survived the shells and the gas were killed by a virus, and the deaths were recorded in the same administrative systems that had recorded everything else, and the forms were filed and the slots were noted as vacated, and the war's paperwork continued past the war itself. Because the paperwork was not about the men, and never had been, and the paperwork did not stop when the men did.